Thanks very much, Spencer. Now I'd like to turn it over to our third panelist, M.V Ramana. M.V Ramana is Professor and Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He's also Director of the Liu Institute for Global Issues and the Acting Director of the Center for India and South Asia Research in the Institute of Asian Research. This research is in the broad area of international security and energy supply, with a particular focus on topics related to nuclear energy and fissile materials that can be used to make nuclear weapons. He combines technical skills and interdisciplinary methods to address policy-relevant questions related to nuclear security and energy issues. He is also the author of The Power of Promise, which examined nuclear energy in India, and which I'll discuss later during our Q&A. Turning it over to Ramana.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my views here. I'm going to focus a little bit different from Tom and Spencer, though much of what I will be saying will be familiar to them. I'm going to talk about the main, what I see as the main activity in terms of engaging the public, which is selling or overselling, as I would call it, nuclear energy. And I'm going to sort of follow what you, Ahmed, mentioned during your questions that you posed, which is to frame it not as the nuclear industry, but as the nuclear enterprise, or as I termed it in my book on India, as the nuclear establishment. So this is not just the nuclear industry, but the various other institutions that are related to nuclear energy, as well as various parts of the government, which are also involved in very similar purposes. And so much of what I think the industry does and enterprise does is in the nature of what one might call propaganda. So this, I think, there's some 3 or 4 points that I'm going to pull out, but there's much more that one can discuss. Given the constraints of time, I'm going to sort of limit myself to just a few points. And I'll draw primarily on my work on India, as well as the work I've been doing on small modular reactors. So some of the points that we see repeatedly coming out from the nuclear enterprise is the claim that nuclear energy is essential. So for example, in the United Kingdom, about a decade ago, when a little more than a decade ago, when Hinkley Point was being considered, there was a lot of discussion about how without this plant, there would be no electricity to run the country. And the head of EDF in 2007 famously said that by 2017, people in England will be cooking their Christmas turkeys using electricity from Hinkley Point. And this, again, has a long history to this kind of a claim. In the first UN International Conference in Geneva in 1955, Homi Bhabha, who was the president of the conference, talked about atomic energy as necessary for the continuation of our civilization, no less than that. And he said it's an absolute necessity. And of course, Tom has mentioned Spencer has mentioned that even in the very beginning, people like Saudi were making these very large claims about nuclear energy and how it's going to affect our world. And so this is very long tradition, which I see still continuing. The second claim that we see often is that nuclear energy is cheap or affordable, and it is sort of essential. It's going to be a cheap way to sort of deal with climate change. And I've given a few examples here. And what is striking about this is that almost all circumstances, the initial claims of the industry about the costs of these nuclear reactors and the power they produce is shown to be false. And we are seeing right now what is happening with Westinghouse. Two of the individuals from Westinghouse have been are being prosecuted over the South Carolina BC Summer project. And if you look at the history of the claims made by Westinghouse as well as other people who are involved with the nuclear industry, you will see extremely low cost estimates. So the early cost estimates were $1,400 per kilowatt. If you translate that to today's dollars, it's around under $2,000 per kilowatt. And we all know what the cost of Vogel and the VC Summer project have been. And so this is something which periodically gets disproven. In recent years, I think the primary claim that we've been hearing from the nuclear industry, which I don't think is credible, is that nuclear energy is essential to deal with climate change. In Canada, where I live, the Natural Resources Minister said, I've not seen a credible plan for net zero without nuclear as part of a mix. Unfortunately, there are no credible plans with nuclear either, and that's a separate question. I mean, all of these models have various assumptions, and if you look beneath the hood, you'll find lots of problems in all of these. Lastly, there's also this whole question of, is nuclear energy safe, and can they have accidents? And we've seen many cases where both the nuclear industry and the government officials who are sort of involved in promoting them have tried to make the claim that accidents just cannot happen. And I'll talk about this in some detail by looking at how India talked about nuclear power. And I want to sort of, at this point, take us a moment aside to say that, the earlier two, the two talks primarily focused on the United States, especially Tom's talk, which is natural because that's what he's been studying. But if we have to think about nuclear energy as a potential solution to climate change or anything of that sort, nuclear power has to grow globally. And therefore, it is important to think about how nuclear energy is dealt with elsewhere as well. And in India, about which I know a lot more, what I see is that in terms of sort of Tom's periodization of how the industry has dealt with the public, India is still very much stuck in the trust the experts paradigm. And I'm sort of going to give you an example, again, following your idea, Ahmed, of sort of looking at events like Chernobyl and Fukushima to see how the industry sort of reacted to this. And the primary set of messages that came out of the nuclear establishment at that time was A, sort of deny or trivialize. So a few days after the accident started, the chairman of the Nuclear Power Corporation said, there is no nuclear accident or incident in Japan's Fukushima plants. It's a well-planned energy emergency preparedness program. Then the second kind of claim which you see is that it wasn't so bad. The spread of radiation was not as high as projected. Total casualty due to the nuclear accident was zero. And this is done, in November of 2011, when we know that radiation takes a long time to actually manifest itself as any kind of health impacts. And then, of course, there's this claim about how in Chernobyl, there were only 50 to 60 deaths, which, by that time, the IAEA and the WHO had put out various reports showing a much larger number than that. So the main point, of course, is to say that, even if nuclear accidents happen, it's not so bad. A third kind of message is that, India is different. And a Fukushima-like disaster cannot happen in India for any number of reasons. We don't have boiling water reactors, which is not true, but anyway, things of that sort they would keep saying. They also a false sort of look at history to say, Indian reactors are safe because they survived the Bhuj earthquake, an earthquake that happened in the state of Gujarat in 2001, as well as the tsunami that struck in December 2004. But by the same token, Fukushima reactors had survived many other earthquakes. And so this is not really a valid reason, but they would make these kind of assertions. Then a claim that we have it all figured out, saying that we can handle even an event like Fukushima disaster. And as a reality check, just a year before that, when there was a debate over the nuclear liability bill legislation being considered in the Indian Parliament, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare said we are nowhere near, we don't have the ability to meet a nuclear or radiological emergency. Then there's also this whole stress on superior knowledge. We are the experts, we know everything. And they said we have got total knowledge and design of seismic activities, worst seismic events and tsunamis. have been taken into consideration. However, when many of these reactors that are operating in India were licensed, the assumption was that India would never face a tsunami. And the Reactor Safety Analysis Group in 1986 had asserted that in India, tsunamis and seisures, which are sort of tsunami-like events which happen in peninsulas, do not occur. And the general message is that, we should just relax. The Atomic Energy Commission chief, the chairman, put the possibility of a nuclear plant accident as 1 in infinity, that is 0, which is just scientifically not tenable. But the message is very simple, that we should not, the public should not worry about nuclear power. They have it all figured out, and they should just be allowed to do exactly what they want to do. And unfortunately, this is not, again, unique to India. We saw similar statements that came out of the Soviet Union in the early 1980s. And I give one quote from an article in the Bulletin of the IAEA, where the representative of the Soviet Union to the IAEA said the safety of nuclear power plants in the Soviet Union is assured by a wide spectrum of measures. And unfortunately, we know what happened in 1986 after that. The overconfidence that the Indian establishment has is not just a public ploy, but it also results in various kinds of poor choices in design, in inadequate safety studies, in poor safety practices, and so on. So, for example, the prototype fast breeder reactor that India is building is built with a very limited containment capacity. The containment dome is really not strong enough to be able to withstand a core disassembly accident that could occur in this design. Likewise, soon after Fukushima, the Indian government licensed authorized the construction of 6 EPR reactors in a location called Jaitapur, which was known to be seismically very problematic. And as safety theorists sort of remind us, there is a paradox here that if an organization is convinced that it has achieved a safe culture, it almost certainly has not. And I think that's something which we see in India and in many other places as well. The other thing which I would like to sort of talk about is that the nuclear industry, when it talks to the public or others who are supportive of the nuclear industry, they don't tell you various things. So, for example, in the case of small modular reactors, which is ironic because they don't call it small modular nuclear reactors, it makes it a little bit more cumbersome, but it's actually more honest to talk about nuclear. But I suspect that the word nuclear is considered to be invoking fear, and so they don't want to even mention that word. But what they don't hear is that small also means that the cost per unit power capacity is going to be higher. There's going to be more spent fuel or waste per unit of energy produced because they are smaller. There's a greater amount of neutron leakage and so on. That learning, which is supposed to lower costs, might actually make plants more expensive. And we've seen that in the cases of France and the United States. And likewise in India, for example, at the reactors that are being constructed in Kudankulam, there are 3 groups of 2 that have been constructed, Kudankulam 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and now 5 and 6 has just started construction. The costs of these have been going up consistently by about 30% each time. And also, even if there is going to be learning, there would be having a very large number of loss leaders that would have to be built, even going by their plants. And lastly, when it comes to the issue of proliferation, you never hear that even small nuclear plants have large requirements in terms of, if you measure it by the amounts of bombs worth that can be made from the material that's used for these weapons. And of course, what you don't also hear is that small modular reactors also can undergo accidents. And we have seen small reactors in the past undergo accidents. And more important, there's a huge amount of theoretical literature that tells you that it's hard, if not impossible, to predict nuclear accidents. We've learned from Chick Pero that nuclear power plants have intrinsic structural features that make it very hard to envision all possible accident pathways. It's not possible to set up safety systems to protect against unanticipated accident sequences, and also a lot of work, including work that I have myself done, including with John Downer, who I believe you're going to be hearing from tomorrow or the day after, about why risk assessments are unreliable. And also the other thing which you never hear from them is that the safety of a nuclear plant depends not just on the technology, but also the organization that's going to be managing it. And this is something we've heard at length from the Berkeley High Reliability Organization group, who've done a huge amount of work. And one of the things that they point out is that organizations that will manage such technologies have very stringent demands that are very hard to meet. And in my own study, looking at nuclear power in India, these conditions that the HRO researchers identify were not met by India's nuclear establishment after decades of experience of operating nuclear plants. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, what are the chances that a new country adopting nuclear power will meet these stringent safety demands? You don't also hear about the problem of overconfidence that I mentioned, about the problem that many times there's going to be conflicting priorities. Safety is, though they may talk about it as being the chief priority or the main priority, often takes a back seat to other priorities like cost cutting against the necessity to build up nuclear fleets fast, etc. We don't hear about the possibility of regulatory failures. And lastly, that small modular reactors will not solve all of the problems confronting nuclear power, including proliferation, waste, cost, and safety. And quite often, if you try to do one well, then you actually will probably make one of the other problems worse. So to summarize, what I see is that most of the time the nuclear industry uses various kinds of advocacy strategies to persuade people that nuclear power is safe or cheap or clean. And they basically have two broad set of strategies that are sort of captured with these two quotes. One from Alice in Wonderland, where the aim is to basically tell people to believe impossible things. For example, that nuclear power plants are actually going to be constructed cheaply and on time, which almost has never happened. Or that somehow, and this is from a quote from Great Gatsby, that somehow in the future everything is going to be fine. So forget the history. In the future, everything is going to be all right. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ramana. I'd like to invite our three panelists now to share their videos so that we can have a short discussion.